All right, so here is video 2 from chapter 9, section 1. All right, so main focus here. So people acquire certain behaviors through classical conditioning, which is a learning procedure in which associations are made between an unconditioned stimulus and a neutral stimulus. So to explain what this is, in pictures, I think this is the best way to do it. So the experiment was done by Ivan Pavlov, and maybe you remember we talked about this very briefly earlier in the school year. So this was an experiment he did with his dog. So you can see here in the top image, so before conditioning, there was a neutral stimulus, which is a bell. A neutral stimulus is a stimulus that does not initially elicit any part of an unconditioned response. So when this experiment started, Pavlov would ring the bell and the dog had no reaction to it. There was no salivation, nothing happened. All right. Also, before any conditioning took place, food was introduced to the dog. The food in this case is called the unconditioned stimulus, which is an event that elicits a certain predictable response, typically without any previous training. So the food is introduced to the dog before any conditioning takes place, and the dog just naturally salivates at seeing the food. The salivation in response to food is called an unconditioned response. So it's unconditioned. The dog just naturally had this innate ability. It knows when it sees food, I'm going to eat, and I need to start salivating to get my digestive system ready. Okay, so these are unconditioned stimulus. Okay, what happened in this experiment is during conditioning, the bell was rang every time food was introduced to the dog. So over time, what happened is the bell, which becomes the conditioned stimulus, we're trying to condition the dog to do something, causes the dog to salivate even when food is not present. All right, so come back here. So during conditioning, we rang a bell, the conditioned stimulus, while we're introducing food, the unconditioned stimulus, and as a reaction, both are causing salivation, which is the unconditioned response. But when we take the food away, the dog has created an association now between the bell and food. And so even without the food being present, the dog is going to salivate. We call this a conditioned response. He was conditioned to salivate at the ringing of a bell. Okay? So these are those vocab terms that can be challenging because they all sound very similar. But looking at them in this pictorial representation and examining this experiment hopefully helps you understand the difference between what an unconditioned stimulus is, what a conditioned stimulus is, an unconditioned response, and then a conditioned response. All right. And so hopefully that helps. If you're having confusion or question with it, please send me an email and I can go over it with you some more. All right. So what happened here is what we discovered, the connection and the impact. So conditioning occurs when a neutral stimulus, in this case the neutral stimulus was the bell, causes a formally unrelated response. All right. So by studying conditioned reflexes, it became possible to examine human behavior objectively instead of subjectively. All right, so a measurable fact is something that's objective versus a personal perspective is something that's subjective, that depends on the person that's evaluating it. So objective is a more meaningful research tool. So a few of the terms. So Pavlov also, in this experiment, he continued on, and you can read about this on page 244 in your book, but he continued to explore this process of generalization and discrimination. So what happens here is generalization occurs when an animal responds to a second stimulus, similar to the original conditioned stimulus, which the bell became the conditioned stimulus, without prior training with the second stimulus. So for example, the dog would salivate at the sight of a circle. He would put a circle in front of him and get the dog to salivate. But then he would start to switch out the circle and he would put an oval in place of the circle. And what happened is the dog would still salivate at the sight of the oval when it was introduced with the dog's food. This is called generalization. The oval and the circle looked so similar that the dog felt as if they were the same. But upon further training and further conditioning, Pavlov was actually able to teach the dog discrimination. Discrimination is the ability to respond differently to different stimuli. So in the same example with the circle and the oval, he was able to train the dog to salivate only at the sight of the circle by always pairing the meat powder with a circle, but he never paired the meat powder with the oval. So eventually the dog was able to discriminate the subtle differences between a circle and an oval and would know that the circle was the only one that was going to be paired with the meat powder. All right, so these are some additional terms, generalization and discrimination, that can be used. Okay, so where does this lead us? So generalization and discrimination are complementary to each other, right? They may occur spontaneously. They may also be taught. So here's another example. So Johnny associates the sound of a dentist drill, a conditioned stimulus. We're conditioning him with a fearful reaction, a conditioned reaction. He's conditioned the drill creates a fearful reaction, so conditioned stimulus creates a conditioned reaction. After several exposures to a dentist drill, Johnny may find that he has generalized this uncomfortable feeling to the sound of other non-dental drills. So it may be that he hears anything that sounds remotely like a drill, and he now has this fearful reaction to it, this conditioned response. All right, that's generalization. He's generalized his fear, okay? Later, though, he may learn to discriminate between the sounds of dental drills and maybe other drills, a similar stimulus. And he can, with this discrimination, maybe he can subside some of his fears when he goes to the dentist and not react to absolutely everything. So can you guys think of any similar examples of generalization and discrimination that maybe you've experienced? If you can think of any and you feel like sharing, go ahead and send me a message and let me know. All right, so let's make a prediction. If Pavlov stopped presenting food after the sound of the tuning fork or bell, there's, some people say tomato, tomato, some people say used a bell, some people say used a tuning fork. But nevertheless, if he stopped presenting food after the sound of the bell, would the dog always continue to salivate? Well, probably not. The dog would eventually be now conditioned to be like, okay, there's no food coming after the sound of the bell or the tuning fork. So this is another term. This is called extinction. All right, so what does it mean to be extinct? Extinction is the gradual disappearance of a conditioned response when the conditioned stimulus is repeatedly presented without the unconditioned stimulus. So we're presenting the bell without the food, and over time, we end up with extinction. However, there's another term here. It's called spontaneous recovery. And spontaneous recovery is the reappearance of an extinguished response after some time has passed. All right, so, sorry, I'm going to go back here. So if we use Pavlov's dog as our example, as we've been using, what happened is Pavlov's dog produced much less saliva during a spontaneous recovery than it did at the end of their original conditioning. So even though the classically conditioned response of the bell ringing with the food causing the salivation, and even without the food, we've conditioned him to salivate just at the ringing of the bell. If we eventually never give him the food, he ends up experiencing extinction. That does not mean that the conditioned response has been completely unlearned. So if you have this rest period is given following extinction, the conditioned response may appear when the conditioned stimulus is present again, but not followed by an unconditioned stimulus. So basically what would happen is, okay, we've stopped giving food when we ring the bell. The dog experiences extinction. He no longer is salivating at the ringing of the bell. But then one day you're like, let me just put the food in there with the bell and see what happens. That is what we call spontaneous recovery. The dog will, again, it'll remember, oh, I'm supposed to salivate at the ringing of the bell, and it can pick that back up again. However, it's not producing as much saliva as it did when we did the original conditioning of the dog. It's not as powerful, and it's not as strong. And if they're alternating lengths and rest periods in this conditioned stimulus, each time the spontaneous recovery is kind of less and less and less. So yeah, there's going to be a response, but it's less and less as you go on. So another good example of this is if you're in a car accident, and then following the car accident, the first time you get back in the car to drive again, it might be difficult. You might be scared, your heart might race, your hands might be shaking, you're nervous to get behind the wheel. After a few days, then it might not bother you quite so much to get back in the car as you've been driving and you realize you're not going to get in an accident every single time. You start to feel a little bit more comfortable and your fears start to subside. But then one day, several months later, as you go to get in your car, all of a sudden your heart begins to race again and your knees and your hands begin to shake. You are experiencing a spontaneous recovery of that fear reaction. So it's come back spontaneously without being introduced to another car accident. So this explains why some of us have these fears that can go away and then spontaneously just kind of pop up again. Okay. So you guys are going to complete the guided reading, which is on Schoology. It's a short answer. You're going to use the textbook to read the questions and fill it in. This is an optional activity, but it will help you learn the material and practice for the quiz, which is due by Sunday. All right. So getting into this conditioning, we just have a little bit left here. Conditioning, how would you use the word above? Well, I think of conditioning, I think of training. I'm training to be better at something. I'm training to be a better athlete or to get in shape or, that sort of thing. Conditioning is something you work at, you practice at. But the term can also be used to describe the process by which you learn superstitions and other behaviors in your daily life. So this is another experiment that you guys can do on your own at home. So this is a simple classical conditioning experiment that you can perform at home. You need a bell or anything you can ring. A whistle will work. You also need a handheld mirror and a room that would become completely dark when the lights are turned off. That's important. So what you're going to do is you're going to hold the bell while you're standing in the room, but you got to stand near the light switch. Once you're in the position, you should ring the bell and then immediately turn off the light. Then after waiting in total darkness for about 15 seconds, turn the light back on. Wait another 15 seconds with the light on, ring the bell, and then immediately turn the light back off. Again, wait 15 seconds in the dark. You're going to repeat this procedure 20 to 30 times. All right, it's going to take a lot, but it'll be worth it. Making sure that in each case, the bell is rung immediately before you turn the light off. So after numerous pairings, you should be ready to see the results. So what will happen is, with the light on, you're going to watch your eyes closely in the mirror and then ring the bell, and then don't turn the light off. And then watch what happens. Your pupils should dilate evenly without even a change in the light, because you have conditioned them that you're going to turn the light off and it'll be dark in 15 seconds. So it's a conditioned response that you can check out.